The scan results came back wrong. Not wrong in the way scans sometimes came back with noise interference or ghost readings from dead satellites. Wrong in the way that made Doris set down her cold drink and lean forward in her seat and read the numbers a second time, slowly, the way she read things when she was hoping she had made a mistake. She had not made a mistake. The Ardent Measure was a patrol vessel, mid-sized, built for long quiet runs along the outer survey boundary. Doris had commanded it for 11 years. In that time she had seen plenty of strange readings. Methane plumes that looked like engine exhaust. Crystalline asteroid formations that read as structured metal on old scanners. Once, memorably, a dead vessel from a species nobody had ever catalogued, drifting without power in a system with no record of visitation. That had taken 6 months of bureaucratic reporting to close. This was different from all of those. Kareth 9 sat on her main screen as a brown and gray mass, streaked with yellow cloud bands that were not water vapor. Sulfur. The planet exhaled sulfur the way habitable worlds exhaled oxygen. Its surface temperature sat at 67 degrees by standard measure on a cool day. Its gravity ran 40% above normal, which meant anything that landed on it would feel heavier, slower, more tired. Its atmosphere had been classified as immediately lethal to every species in the Galactic Registry on first contact and had not been reclassified since, because nothing that went down to check had come back to argue the point. 3 missions had been sent to Kareth 9 over a period of 20 years. The first had been a full survey team of 8. They had established a surface camp and stopped communicating 11 hours later. The second mission had been a recovery and investigation team of 5, sent to find out what happened to the first. They lasted 6 hours before their distress beacon went active, and then it stopped too. The third mission had been a single automated probe, because the commission had run out of volunteers and ethics boards had run out of patience. The probe had transmitted for 4 days before its signal cut. Nobody knew exactly what had happened to it. The data it sent before going silent was still being analyzed, mostly because what it described did not make complete sense and the analysts kept hoping the next pass through the numbers would produce a cleaner answer. Kareth 9 had been formally quarantined 8 years ago. Its file in the Galactic Survey Commission database had a red border and a symbol that translated, roughly, as do not. And yet, the biosignature on Doris's screen was not mechanical. It was not residual trace data from a decomposing body, which scanners sometimes picked up for years after death. It was active. It had a pulse rhythm. It was moving, slowly, along what her topography map identified as a cave network running through the equatorial ridge of the planet's northern landmass. Doris called Ren over from the science station. Ren was her science officer, a Velhari like herself, younger by about 15 years, with the kind of focused energy that made him useful in exactly these situations. He looked at the screen. He looked at the readings. He ran his own independent scan from his own console without being asked. His scan matched hers. 1 biosignature. Small. Warm-blooded by heat profile. Active. Ren pulled up the Galactic Registry's Biological Classification Index and ran the heat profile and movement pattern against it. The system searched for 40 seconds, which was long for a system that usually answered in 3. Then it returned a result, flagged with a yellow information marker indicating the match was drawing from a restricted subfile. Human. Doris knew what humans were. Most people in the Commission did, in a general way. A young species, pre-stellar by their own development, though they had been contacted and catalogued about 2 centuries prior. They were fragile by galactic standards, highly variable in temperament, and occupied a single solar system at the far end of a quiet arm of the galaxy. They were not considered a significant presence in current affairs. Their threat rating in the official database was listed as low, with a note appended by whatever analyst had written the file. Species shows creativity and unpredictability. Recommend continued low-level monitoring. No human vessel had been registered in this sector in more than a decade. Humans did not have ships capable of reaching this sector without serious assistance. There was no record of any human expedition to Kareth 9, not in the official files, not in the restricted files Ren quietly checked while Doris was pulling on her jacket. The human biosignature moved along the cave ridge, slow and steady, and then stopped, as if it were resting, as if it had somewhere to be and was in no particular hurry. Doris called the rest of the crew to the bridge. Solely, The medical officer arrived first, still pulling her hair back. She looked at the screen and said nothing, which was how Doris knew she understood the weight of it. Brev and Tarek came in together, the two soldiers on the crew, both of them reading the room before they read the screen. That was good habit. Doris told them what they had found. She told them what she intended to do. She told them the risks clearly, without softening them, because she had found over 11 years that people made better decisions when they understood exactly what they were stepping into. The shuttle bay was at the back of the ship. They suited up in silence. The environmental suits were the heavy kind, rated for extreme conditions, which in practice meant they could handle environments that would kill an unsuited Velhari in under a minute. Kareth 9's atmosphere was rated to breach that threshold in 8 minutes on average. The suits were built for 4 hours of continuous use under pressure. They had margin. Not much, but some. Tarek, checking the seals on his gloves, said that this was exactly how the report from the second mission started. The part where they described suiting up and going in with good confidence. Nobody replied to that. The shuttle dropped out of the belly of the ardent measure and fell toward the yellow clouds of Kareth 9. On the external cameras, the planet grew larger and less abstract. The cloud bands were thicker than they looked from orbit, and the shuttle rocked in the upper atmosphere before the stabilizers caught up. Below the clouds, the surface resolved into dark rock and pale mineral flats and the jagged broken line of the equatorial ridge, which looked, from above, like the spine of something enormous that had died there a very long time ago. The biosignature held steady on Doris's handheld scanner. Still in the caves. Still moving, just slightly. Still alive. Doris kept her eyes on the terrain and did not let herself think too hard about what they were going to find, because thinking too hard about things before you found them was a habit that led to going in with the wrong expectations. She had learned that the hard way, in earlier years. Whatever was down in those caves, it was alive. For now, that was enough to go on. The cave mouth smelled like something burning that had never been on fire. That was the only way Doris could describe it later, when she was writing her report and trying to find language adequate to Kareth 9's particular kind of wrongness. The smell came through the suit filters as a faint chemical note, something sharp and mineral and deeply unpleasant, which meant the actual unfiltered smell was presumably much worse. The rock around the cave entrance was the color of old blood, streaked with pale yellow deposits that crusted along the lower edges like salt around a wound. The team moved in single file. Doris at the front, then Rin with his scanner, then Soli, then Tarek, then Brev watching their rear. The cave swallowed them quickly. Within 30 meters the daylight from outside became a pale suggestion and then disappeared entirely, and the suits switched to their internal lights automatically, throwing sharp, white beams into the dark ahead. Brev's suit reported a hairline stress fracture in the left shoulder seal within the first 10 minutes. He reported it calmly, the way soldiers reported things that were bad but not yet critical. They had 3 hours and 40 minutes left on the suit timers before the seals degraded past safe tolerance. Doris filed that number in the part of her mind that tracked important constraints and kept moving. The cave went down before it went forward. The floor sloped at a steady angle, following what Ren identified as an old lava tube, long cooled. The walls smooth and curved where the ancient rock had flowed and hardened. The temperature on the external sensors ticked downward as they descended, not to anything comfortable, but away from the surface numbers that the suits had been straining against. 49 degrees. 44. 41. Still lethal without protection. Still better than outside. The bioluminescent growth started about 200 meters in. Fungal, Ren said when he scanned it, though he admitted his database had nothing quite like it. It grew in thin sheets along the lower walls and put out a faint orange light, barely enough to see by, but enough to feel like something alive in a place that otherwise felt entirely opposed to life. Doris did not say that out loud because it was the kind of observation that did not help anyone focus. They found the first sign of habitation at 320 meters. Bones, sorted into piles by size, set along the left wall of the cave in a way that was clearly not accidental. Small bones in one pile, larger ones in another. The biggest things that looked like they had come from animals the size of a large dog. If dogs had developed on a planet that wanted them dead, were stacked flat, the way you stack timber for storage. Some of them had been worked, scraping marks along the surfaces, edges that had been sharpened against rock. Tools, or the raw material for tools, stored carefully by someone who understood the value of materials and did not waste them. Ren crouched over the largest pile and scanned without touching. He said, quietly, that the bones showed no sign of age degradation. Whatever creature had made these piles had been here recently. By recently, he meant within the last few months at most. Sully found the tally marks 15 meters further on. They were scratched into a flat section of wall at roughly chest height for a small adult or a taller child. Groups of 5 marks with a diagonal slash through each group, the way certain counting systems organized large numbers for quick reading. Sully counted them twice and got the same answer both times. She told Doris the number in a low voice. The number was large. Large enough that if each mark represented a single day, the count spanned years. If each mark represented something longer, a week, a month, a season, the count was longer still. They kept moving. The cave branched twice and Doris followed the biosignature reading on her scanner each time, taking the branch the signal came from, trusting the equipment over her instincts in the dark. The signal got stronger, closer, and then it stopped moving. It had not disappeared. It was simply still. Doris raised a fist, the hand signal for stop, and the team halted behind her. She listened. The cave was not quiet. There was a deep sound coming from somewhere below and ahead, a slow rhythmic pulse that she eventually identified as a thermal vent, the kind of geological breathing that happened when a planet's interior heat had somewhere to push upward. But underneath that, just at the edge of where sound became sensation, there was something else. Breathing. The chamber opened up around the next turn. It was large, a natural bulge in the lava tube where the rock had widened before it narrowed again, maybe 15 meters across at its widest point. The orange fungal light was thicker here, growing in wide patches across the upper walls. And there was another light source to a crack in the lower left wall, where heat glow seeped through from something below, warm and reddish, steady as a banked fire. There were pelts on the floor, animal hides, cleaned and cured by some method that had left them soft and flexible, laid out in overlapping layers to form a sleeping area. There were tools hanging from rock protrusions along the wall, bone-handled things with worked stone points, small and precise. There were flat rocks arranged in a pattern near the thermal crack that looked like a work surface, with smaller stones sorted by size placed on them in a way that suggested a system of organization. And there was the child. She was crouched at the far side of the chamber, her back to the wall, facing them. She had been there when they came around the corner. She had not made a sound. She had simply watched them come in and waited to see what they would do. She was small, human, clearly the shape of her face, the proportion of her limbs, the way she held herself. Approximately 9 or 10 years old by the developmental charts Soli had in her medical files. Her skin was darker than baseline from long exposure to mineral residue in the environment. Her hair was pulled back and tied with something that looked like sinew. She wore a garment assembled from multiple animal hides, stitched together with rough but effective technique, covering her from shoulders to knees. She was barefoot. On the sulfur rock of Kareth 9, in 40 degrees of heat, in an atmosphere that would begin killing an unsuited Velhari in less than 8 minutes. She was barefoot, and she was breathing the air. No mask, no filter, no suit, nothing between her and the planet. And she was alive. The sharpened bone in her right hand was roughly the length of her forearm. She held it the way someone held a tool they knew how to use, not raised as a threat, just present, available, as naturally as a person might hold a walking stick. Her eyes moved across the 5 of them in a slow, deliberate sweep. She was not panicking. She was not crying. She was reading them the way you read terrain before you move through it, noting distances, noting how they stood, noting where the exits were. Ren's scanner made a soft noise beside Doris's ear. He read it without looking away from the girl and said, barely above a whisper, that her vitals were registering as fully normal. Stable pulse. Stable respiration. No signs of chemical distress. Soli said, even more quietly, that was not possible. The girl's eyes moved to Soli when she spoke. Sharp. Focused. Not afraid. Doris raised both hands slowly, palms out. The universal gesture that meant empty, means no harm, which she was aware the child might not recognize at all. She spoke in standard Galactic, which was the common tongue of commissioned space. She said hello. She said they were not there to hurt her. She asked if the child could understand her. Nothing. Doris tried the 5 most common trade dialects. The girl watched her speak each one with the same patient, evaluating attention, and gave no response. Ren, who had been quietly pulling files on his wrist unit while Doris spoke, said he had a partial human language file, a common one, the dominant language of the human home continent where most early contact had been recorded. He was not sure it would help. He patched it to the external speaker on Doris's suit and suggested she try 3 words, the 3 most likely to register if the child had any familiarity with the language at all. Doris tried the 3 words. "We are friends." The girl's expression changed. Not into warmth, not into relief, but into something sharper. Recognition, maybe, or at least the shape of a word that meant something she had heard before, in some form. Her eyes narrowed slightly. She looked at Doris more directly. And then she spoke. It was not the language Ren had loaded, but it shared bones with it, the way 2 rivers share a source. Slow words, careful words, pronounced with the precision of someone who had learned to speak from a limited teacher and a great deal of silence. Ren's translation filter caught fragments, not full sentences. Something about lasting. Something about here. Then the last sentence came through almost cleanly. "You will not last long here." It was not a threat. The tone was wrong for a threat. It was information. The same way you might tell someone new to the mountains that the weather turns fast, that they should watch the sky. Simple fact. She had looked at them in their suits, in their equipment, with their numbers and their weapons, and her assessment was that they would not last long. She was not wrong. The girl turned and walked toward the back of the chamber, toward a passage that was not visible from the entrance, narrow and dark. She moved easily in the low light, placing her feet without looking at the ground, the way things move when they know every stone by memory. At the passage entrance she paused. She looked back. The tilt of her head was slight, barely a movement, but the meaning was clear enough. "Follow." Doris looked at Tarek. Tarek looked at Brev. Brev said nothing, which was his way of saying he would go wherever the commander went. Doris followed the child into the dark. She had made herself a home out of the things that wanted to kill her. That was the thought that settled into Doris's mind as she stepped into the deeper chamber and looked around at what the child had built. Not a shelter in the sense of a desperate huddle against danger. A home. There was a difference, and the difference was visible in every detail of the place and the way the pelts were arranged, not just for warmth, but for comfort, overlapping at angles that would let someone roll over and sleep without losing coverage. In the way the tools were hung at different heights, shortest to the left and longest to the right, within easy reach of someone who knew exactly which one they needed without looking. In the flat stone surface near the thermal crack where ash had been swept to one side with something like a brush, and the working area kept clear. The child ran, as they would come to call her, after she pointed to herself and repeated the sound 3 times with the patience of someone correcting a slow student sat cross-legged on the far edge of the pelt arrangement and watched them arrange themselves in the chamber. She had set aside the sharpened bone. It was not gone. It was within easy reach, resting against the wall beside her right knee. But it was set aside. That was a distinction worth noting. Doris had Ren work on the translation while she watched Soli begin the slow process of communicating a medical scan request to Ren. Soli held up the scanner, showed that it did nothing harmful, aimed it at her own arm first, and showed Ren the result on the small screen, a moving image of bone and tissue, clearly unthreatening. Ren watched all of this with the evaluating patience she seemed to bring to everything, and then held out her own arm. Not a nervous offering. More the way you extend a limb to a mechanic who wants to look at something cooperative but not invested. The numbers that came back from the scanner made Soli go very still. She read them twice. She recalibrated the scanner and ran the scan again. The results were the same. She looked at Doris with an expression that was trying hard to be professional and mostly succeeding, and she said, quietly, that she was going to need a moment to process what she was looking at. Doris told her to take whatever time she needed. Meanwhile, Ren had been building a slow, careful exchange with Ren using the partial language file, and a great deal of pointing, gesture, and repetition. Ren was good at that kind of work, patient in a way that Doris appreciated, willing to look uncertain, willing to try the wrong word and accept correction without embarrassment. Ren responded to that. She corrected him several times, always by saying the right word back to him clearly and waiting for him to repeat it, the way a teacher corrects a student without making the student feel foolish. What came out of 2 hours of that exchange, in fragments and incomplete sentences and a great deal of guesswork that Ren flagged carefully in his notes, was this. Ren did not remember a time before the caves. Her earliest memory was of a woman she called, in her language, something that translated roughly as the one before. The woman had been the one who taught her what to eat and what not to eat, which cave creatures were safe to approach and which ones would harm her, how to work stone, how to read the cave winds, which shifted based on the thermal vents below and could tell you, if you knew how to listen, when the surface was going to have an acid event and when it was going to be merely bad rather than catastrophic, how to keep the stalkers from seeing her as prey. The woman had died. Ren did not know how long ago. She described it simply and without apparent distress. The woman had gotten sick in a way that was different from the regular sickness that came and went, and then she had stopped waking up. Ren had waited 2 days to be sure, and then had handled the practical matters that followed, which she did not describe in detail. After that, she had been alone. The tally marks on the wall near the cave entrance had been the woman's. Ren had not kept her own count after she died, not of time in the large sense. She counted other things: how many times the ridge stalkers changed their patrol range, how many cave seasons it took for the blue fungal beds near the lower passage to regrow after she harvested them, how many meals she could get from one large kill before the heat started to change the meat. Practical counting. Survival counting. She did not know her own age. Soli had finished her analysis by the time Ren reached the end of what Ren was willing to share for now. She gave her report in the flat, careful tone of someone who had decided that the most useful thing she could do was state facts without commentary and let the facts do the work. Ren's bone density was elevated significantly above baseline human. Her skeletal structure had adapted to the higher gravity, denser, heavier, more compact at the joints. This was not unusual in itself. Long-term gravity exposure did that. What was unusual was the degree of it. The degree suggested this was not a change that had happened in one lifetime. It was baked in deeper than that. Her lung tissue had restructured. Soli showed Doris the scan image. The internal branching of the air passages was finer than standard human, more complex, with additional filtration structures that had no name in the medical database because they had never been observed before. They appeared to allow Ren to breathe Kareth 9's atmosphere by filtering the sulfur compounds at the point of entry rather than relying on any external protection. She was, in Soli's careful words, producing her own filtration chemistry, internally, as a biological function. Her skin showed trace chemical deposits consistent with a self-produced protective layer, thin, invisible to the eye, but present in the scan as a faint coating on every exposed surface. The planet's contact acids that would begin to damage unprotected Velhari tissue within minutes were simply bouncing off her. Her pain response nerve pathways were partially restructured. Soli said this carefully, watching Doris's face as she said it. What it meant, practically, was that Ren likely experienced pain at a lower intensity than a baseline human. Not that she felt nothing, the pathways were still there. But the volume, so to speak, had been turned down. Perhaps way down. The planet had applied pressure, and her body had adjusted the settings. Doris thought about the barefoot walk on Sulfur Rock and said nothing. Brev had been watching the tunnel entrance for most of this time, which was what he was supposed to do. He reported now, quietly, that something large had been outside the passage for the past 20 minutes. He could hear it, a slow, rhythmic sound that he identified as footstep weight shifting, back and forth, the movement of something that was not hunting but was present. He described the profile as matching the Kareth Ridge Stalker, which was the planet's documented apex predator and the creature identified in the first mission's last transmissions as the probable cause of cat. Tarek raised his weapon. Ren's hand came out sideways and pressed lightly against Tarek's arm. She did not grab. She did not push. Just the slight, flat-palmed press, and a single look, and Tarek lowered the weapon before he fully understood why he had. Then Ren made a sound. It was short, low, with a particular resonance to it, not quite a word in any language, more like a pitch and a rhythm than a vocalization. It was aimed at the tunnel entrance. The pacing outside stopped. The weight shift sounds faded. The large thing moved away. In under a minute the passage was quiet again. Ren asked, carefully, what that had been. Ren considered how to explain it with the words they shared. and then said something that his filter caught as, "That one is old. It does not hunt me. There is an arrangement between us." Soli asked if she meant she had an understanding with the stalker. Ren looked at the word understanding for a moment and then accepted it. Yes, an understanding. It did not hunt her. She did not take from it. When she moved through its territory, she moved in a particular way so it knew it was her. In return, it left her alone. And once, when something larger had come down from the upper cave systems looking for new territory, the stalker had pushed it back. She did not know if it had done that for her, or simply for its own reasons. Either way, the outcome had been the same. The silence after she finished saying this was a particular kind of silence. The kind that happened when a group of people all had the same thought at the same time and none of them knew how to say it. Doris checked the suit timer. 90 minutes to critical failure. She told the team they needed to move. Then she turned to Ren and chose her words carefully, using the clearest and simplest forms of the language fragments she had learned from Ren in the past hour. She asked Ren if she would come with them. Back to the ship. Away from the planet. Ren looked at her for a long time. It was not a hesitant look. It was a calculating one. She looked at Doris the way she had looked at everything else, measuring, noting, deciding. Then she asked her question. One question, in her slow and careful words, and Ren caught it cleanly. Will I be able to come back? Doris looked at the chamber around her. The home made from the bones of things that had tried to eat its maker. The tally marks of a woman who had survived long enough to teach everything she knew to a child. The thermal light that Ren had dammed and redirected with stones over months or years into something that warmed and lit a living space. She said yes. She meant it. Ren stood up. She picked up 3 things from the wall: the sharpened bone, a small flat stone with marks on it, and something wrapped in hide that she tucked against her side without showing what it was. Then she walked toward the exit without waiting for them to lead. Before anyone decided what to do with Ren, Ren had already decided what to do with the ship. She had started with the walls. Soli found her in the medical bay an hour after they reached orbit, running her fingertips slowly along the panel, seams with her eyes half closed, the way a person reads raised text. Soli tried to get her to sit on the examination table. Ren looked at the table, then at the room, then at Soli, and moved to the table with the tolerant compliance of someone who had agreed to an inconvenience out of courtesy rather than necessity. She sat. She held still, but her eyes kept moving across the ceiling joints, the conduit routing, the ventilation grill, the way the artificial light distributed itself differently near the walls than at the center of the room. She was reading the ship the way she read caves, looking for how it breathed, where it was strong, where the pressure went when it built up somewhere. Soli ran the full examination and kept her findings off the ship's shared network for the time being, saving them locally, because the moment she filed them centrally, a clock would start on how long she had before someone at the commission started making decisions based on them. She wanted Doris to see the complete picture before that clock began. Doris was in her quarters talking to people she did not want to talk to. The first call came from Regional Director Vel, who administered the survey boundary from a station 3 days away, and whose face conveyed, across the subspace lag, the particular combination of concern and self-interest that senior administrators learned to wear as a default expression. Vel wanted to know if the biological specimen, he called Ren a biological specimen, twice, before Doris corrected him with a flat tone that made him move quickly past the word was secure, was stable, and could be transferred to a research facility within the week. Doris said she would consider the request. Vel said it was not a request. Doris said she had heard him and ended the call, which was technically within her authority as a field commander and which she was fairly sure Vel would document as insubordination at the first opportunity. The second call was from a man named Orith, who identified himself as representing the Bureau of Alien Species Relations. He was polite in the exhausting way of people who had learned that politeness was the most efficient path to getting what they wanted. He explained, carefully, that the Bureau had been reviewing the preliminary scan data that had been filed automatically by the ship's systems, which meant the automated logging had already pushed data before Doris could contain it, which was a problem she filed away for later, and that the Bureau's position was that the biological profile of the individual recovered from Kareth 9 had diverged sufficiently from standard human classification that her legal status under the Human Diplomatic Protections Charter was potentially unclear. He did not say they wanted to reclassify Ren as non-human. He said the situation required further study before the appropriate framework could be determined. It amounted to the same thing. Doris ended that call too, less politely than the first. The third call was different. It came from a routing code she did not recognize, and when Ren traced it later, he found that it originated from a division whose official communications were not supposed to reach ships in this sector. A military intelligence branch, operating under a name that translated loosely as Survey Oversight, which was the kind of name chosen specifically to be forgettable. The person on the call was a man named Drath. He was quiet. He asked one question. He asked whether the recovered individual showed any signs of intentional genetic modification, engineered sequences, deliberate design markers, anything that looked like it had been put there on purpose rather than arrived at by circumstance. Doris said no. She said it because it was true. Sully's report had shown nothing engineered. What Ren carried in her body looked like adaptation, long and slow and brutal, the kind that happens when generations of living things are pressed against an impossible environment, and the ones that survive are the ones whose slight variations happen to fit. Drath received the answer without any visible reaction. Then he said, quietly, that was the concerning answer. He said it without explaining what would have been the less concerning answer, or why. Then he disconnected. Doris sat with that for a moment. Then she went to find Ren. Ren was no longer in the medical bay. Sully had lost track of her during a moment when she was filing her local notes, and had spent 15 minutes checking the corridors before admitting to Doris that the child had simply left without making a sound. Doris pulled the ship's internal locators and found her in the engine room, which was 2 levels down and required passing through a door that needed a crew access code to open. Ren, when told, said he wanted to know how she had gotten through the door. He checked the access log and found the code had been entered correctly. He checked the camera feed and watched, in the saved footage, Ren stand in front of the door panel for 6 minutes, pressing single keys in short sequences, her head tilted slightly, listening to something the mechanism sound as it accepted or rejected each attempt, most likely until she found the right one. 6 minutes to crack a ship access code from nothing. By ear. Doris found her lying face down on the engine room floor with her ear pressed flat against the hull plating, her eyes closed, perfectly still. The drive vibration came up through the hull at that point as a low, complex pulse. It was not dangerous. It was simply the sound the ship made when it was alive and moving, the sound that the ship's own crew had long ago stopped hearing because they were always inside it. Doris crouched down and asked what she was doing. Ren said, without opening her eyes, that the ship was afraid of the planet. She could hear it in the way the hull spoke. Something had changed in the vibration when they were close to Kareth 9, and it had not fully gone back to what it was before. Doris said, gently, that ships did not feel afraid. Ren opened her eyes and looked at Doris with the patient expression she used when she had decided not to argue with something she disagreed with. She sat up. She did not press the point. It was Ren who presented the linguistic analysis that evening. He had been working on it since they left the planet, building a structural map of Ren's language, tracing its roots. He was thorough, and he had good instincts, and what he found made the table quiet for a long stretch after he finished speaking. The main layer of Ren's language was recognizably related to the human language in the Commission's file English, the dominant tongue of the First Contact era. But beneath it was something else. A second layer, older, woven into the grammar and the vocabulary of everything she said. He had been able to identify parts of it. Old Norse, a historical human dialect that had not been in common spoken use for well over 1,000 years by human reckoning. And beneath even that, fragments he could not identify at all, which did not match anything in the language database from any known species. The woman who had raised Ren the one before had spoken a language that was already ancient when she arrived on Kareth 9. Or had been speaking something she had assembled from pieces of things that were already disappearing when she learned them. Either way, it meant the timeline was not what they had assumed. The common assumption on the ship had been that Ren had arrived on Kareth 9 relatively recently, a lost child from some recent disaster. An accident. The language said otherwise. The language said that whatever had put a human on Kareth 9 had happened a very long time ago. Ren had been sitting at the edge of the briefing table during Ren's report, eating a ration pack that she had examined thoroughly before opening and which she was now working through with no particular enthusiasm, but no complaint. She had understood maybe a third of what Ren said. She had watched the rest with the concentrated attention of someone filling gaps from context. When Rin finished, Rin set down the ration pack. She looked at the table's surface, at the flat gray of it, and then she looked up. She looked at Doris specifically. She had been working on the language every hour since she boarded the ship, listening to the crew, repeating things silently, her lips moving faintly when she thought no one was watching. She had been building vocabulary the way she had presumably built everything else in her life steadily, practically, without wasting effort. She spoke in standard now, slowly, choosing words carefully, the accent rough but the structure clear. She said, "Someone put me there." She said, "I want to know who." Doris looked at her across the table. This small, scarred, careful child who had been alone on a death world for years and had looked at that and simply continued. Who had made an arrangement with an apex predator, who had listened to the ship through its hull, who had cracked a door code by ear in 6 minutes. Doris said, "So do I." GSC station Torrin smelled like recycled air and political tension, which was the natural atmosphere of any place where administrators gathered in numbers. The docking arms extended and locked onto the ardent measure with the confident mechanical certainty of an institution that had decided the matter of what would happen next. There were 12 people in the reception party on the dock. 3 of them were in official uniforms. 2 were in the plain clothes that meant they were not supposed to be noticed, which meant they were the most important ones there. The rest were staff, data recorders, and 2 security personnel who kept their hands low and their eyes on the ship's airlock. Rin walked out third, behind Doris and Rin. The reception party had been arranged to look welcoming. It did not look welcoming. It looked like a net that had been taught to smile. Rin looked at it the way she looked at everything from the outside in, reading the structure of it before she responded to any individual part. Her eyes moved to the 2 people in plain clothes first, then to the security personnel, then to the exits, then, finally, to the 3 uniformed officials, the way you save the least dangerous part for last. Several members of the reception party took a step backward without appearing to notice they had done it. Doris moved through the welcome proceedings with the efficiency of someone who intended to be cooperative for exactly as long as it remained useful. She shook hands. She answered the immediate questions about crew health and ship status. She said nothing about Ren beyond confirming that the individual recovered from Kareth 9 was present and in good health. She did not use the words Vel had used. She did not use the words Orith had used. She used no classification words at all. The meeting room they were taken to had comfortable chairs and a long table and a window that looked out at the station's interior dock, where other ships moved in their slow mechanical ballet. Doris sat. Her crew sat. Ren sat at the end of the table with the flat stone from her cave in front of her. She had taken to carrying it as a writing surface, using a stylus she had borrowed from Ren without asking and had not returned, and began making small notations on it in her own system, which nobody could read. Director Vel was already in the room. Orith from the Bureau arrived 2 minutes later. The third person, the one Doris had not spoken with before, arrived last and introduced himself as Sorith, a senior historian attached to the Galactic Archive. He was old, for a Velhari. His eyes were the kind that had seen enough things to stop being easily surprised, but they were also the kind that still got interested. He looked at Ren the way an archivist looks at a document they have been searching for a very long time. Vel went first. He laid out the Commission's position with the practiced brevity of someone who had made similar arguments many times. The recovered individual was unique. Her physiological data was of immense scientific value. The appropriate place to study that value was a controlled research facility with proper resources and expertise. He said the word research in a way that meant containment. Doris said no. Vel said it was not a question of saying no. He said it with the patience of someone explaining gravity to a person who has objected to falling. Doris said she had heard him. She turned to Sorith, because Sorith was the only person in the room who had not yet said anything, and asked him what he had come to say. Sorith opened a file on the table panel. He turned it so everyone could see. He said he would explain, and that the explanation would be uncomfortable, and that everyone in the room had a right to hear it. Approximately 430 years ago, before the Galactic Commission had made formal contact with the human species, a civilization called the Dravari had been conducting what they internally categorized as environmental limit research. They had a question. The question was, What was the actual ceiling of biological adaptation? Not theoretical, not modeled. What could living tissue, pressed against a truly hostile environment over sufficient time, actually become? They needed subjects. They needed subjects from a species that was unprotected under galactic law, uncontacted, uncatalogued, without diplomatic standing. They chose humans, who at that point in history had not yet been visited by any commission representative and were therefore, legally, invisible. They took subjects. Not many. Enough to test multiple environments simultaneously. Most did not survive the first year. Kareth 9 was, in the Dravari's own records, labeled a control case. Too extreme to produce useful data. They expected total fatality within months. They deposited 2 human subjects and checked back on automated probe 3 times over 5 years. The first 2 checks registered no biosignatures. They filed the case as closed. They did not check a third time. Their civilization entered a period of internal conflict shortly after and collapsed within 2 generations. The research files were transferred to the Galactic Archive as historical record classified, flagged as atrocity documentation, buried under 17 levels of access restriction. Soreth had found them 4 years ago while working on a broader history of pre-contact species exploitation. He had read the Kareth 9 file and noted the 3rd automated probe had never been sent. He had submitted a query to the Commission about a follow-up scan of Kareth 9. The query had been denied on the grounds that the planet was quarantined. He had submitted it again the following year. Denied again. He had been preparing a 3rd submission when the Ardent Measures preliminary report came through the public filing system, and he had been on the next available transit to Torin within the hour. The room was quiet when he finished. Vel looked at the table surface. Orith looked at nothing in particular, which was the look of a man recalculating. Ren had stopped making marks on her stone. She was looking at Soreth. She had understood more of this than she would have been expected to, given that standard was still new to her. She was fast. She had been fast at everything. Soreth looked back at her, gently, and asked if she had understood. Ren said yes. She said it simply, without drama. He asked if she was angry. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the table in front of her the way she had looked at the cave wall when she was thinking through something that required care. Then she said, I will be. I don't know what to do with it yet. Soreth nodded. They had thought they were testing whether humans could survive Kareth 9. What they had actually tested was what Kareth 9 would become once a human had lived on it long enough. The answer, sitting at the end of the table with a borrowed stylus and a flat stone covered in her own language, was obvious. The alert came through before anyone could respond to that. It came to Doris's wrist unit and to the station public board simultaneously, which meant it had been filed at the commission level and pushed down to all active regional systems. A formal custody order. Ren was to be remanded to the care of the Research Facilitation Bureau for her own safety and for the benefit of galactic scientific understanding. The language was careful. It was also completely clear. Doris read it. She read it twice. Then she set her wrist unit face down on the table. She looked at Ren. She asked him what the fuel status of the Ardent Measure was. Ren said it was full. He said they had refueled on the automated depot 2 days before Torin. He said they could go anywhere in the sector without stopping. Brev, who had been standing near the door with his arms crossed and the expression of a soldier who was watching the situation and making private calculations, looked at Tarek. Tarek looked at the ceiling. He was thinking about something. Vel said that Doris needed to understand the order was not optional. Ren picked up the stylus. She held it between 2 fingers, very still, looking at the table. Then she looked at Doris. She said, I want to go back. Eventually. But first, she said, I want to see the place the ones who did this came from. She meant the Dravari. Their ruins. Their dead system. The place that had decided she was expendable and had never bothered to look back and check. Doris stood up. She collected her wrist unit without turning it back over. She looked at Vel and at Orith, and she said that she had heard the order and would be in touch with the commission regarding her response. She said it with the professional calm of a commander who had made a decision and was giving the room a chance to acknowledge reality before reality became obvious. Then she walked to the door, and her crew walked with her, and Ren came last, dropping the stylus into her pocket and taking the flat stone under her arm like a book she had not finished reading. Soreth did not try to stop them. He called after them, once, and asked Doris if she would file her account publicly when the time came. He meant the full account, the Dravari file, the custody order, all of it. Doris said yes. Sorith said good. He said it like a man who had been waiting a long time for someone to say yes. The ardent measure left Torin without a filed flight plan, which was a violation of standard commission protocol and something that Doris had never done once in 11 years of service. She noted this to herself as the station's docking arms released and the ship pulled clear into open space, and she decided that 11 years of clean records was a reasonable foundation to stand on when someone eventually asked her to justify herself. Ren had already identified the Dravari home system in the archive. The records were old. The coordinates required translation through 2 obsolete charting formats, but they were there, 3 days out from Torin, into a part of the sector that the current commission had largely stopped monitoring because there was nothing there worth watching. Nothing living, anyway. In those 3 days, Ren learned to use the ship's public terminals. She started with the translation interface because language was the most immediate tool and she was practical above everything else. She spent the first day consolidating everything Ren had taught her in the field, running vocabulary drills with the patience of someone who understood that a gap in knowledge was just a problem with a solution you had not reached yet. By the second day, she was asking the terminal questions and reading the answers and asking follow-up questions based on what the answers raised. She asked about the Dravari on the second day. She asked what they had looked like, how large they had been, how long they had lived, what they had built, why they had collapsed. She read everything the public archive file contained. It was not classified at her access level, which was the access level of a general civilian with a station guest pass Ren had arranged for her. The classified portions of the Dravari file were the portions about the experiments. She could see the shape of them even without reading them, the gaps in the record where the public history moved quickly past something it did not want to look at directly. She did not seem surprised that the gaps existed. She seemed to file their location away for later. On the third day, she sat with Soli in the medical bay voluntarily, for the first time without prompting, and asked Soli to explain the scan results to her. The full results, not the simplified version. Soli hesitated, because she was a doctor and doctors developed habits around delivering difficult information carefully, and some of what the scans showed was the kind of thing you built up to. Ren watched her hesitate and said, quietly, that she had grown up on a planet that wanted her dead and had not managed it. She could handle information about her own body. Soli told her everything. Ren listened without interrupting. When Soli finished, Ren sat for a moment and then asked 2 questions. The first was whether any of the adaptations would shorten her life. Soli said, honestly, that she did not know. There was no baseline to compare against, and some of the changes were unprecedented enough that she could not model their long-term effects. Ren accepted this. The second question was whether a child born to her, in the future, would carry the same adaptations. Soli said yes, based on what she could see in the genetic structure. Probably not all of them, not the full degree, but the underlying changes were deep enough to pass forward. Each generation in that environment, Soli said carefully, would likely add to them. Ren said, so it was not just me then. She did not say it with grief. She said it with the tone of someone completing a calculation. The Dravari home system resolved on the view screen over the course of an hour, growing from a pinpoint to a visible structure to something that could be understood in its full extent. It was a collapsed star, long dead, the kind of death that had been slow and partial rather than dramatic, a gradual dimming rather than an explosion, leaving behind a dark mass that reflected nothing and pulled at the light around its edges. The orbiting platforms that had once circled it were still there, in pieces. Chunks of engineered structure, half fused by the heat of the collapse, drifting in their long, slow arcs. The surface of what had been the home world was a frozen shell of compressed atmosphere and old metal, unlit, uncommunicative, waiting for nothing. Ren stood at the observation port and looked at it for a long time. Doris stood beside her and did not say anything, because sometimes things did not need commentary. Ren asked, eventually, whether all civilizations ended. Whether this was where everything came to eventually, the long dark and the drifting wreckage and nobody coming back. Doris said she did not know of any civilization that had lasted forever. She said it honestly. Ren looked at the dead system. She said, we will. 2 words. She did not say them with the energy of a boast or the uncertainty of a wish. She said them the way you state a thing you have simply worked out and decided to be true, the way she had stated everything since the moment Doris had first spoken to her in the caves. As information, as fact, as something she had already added to the list of things she knew. Ren found the data buoy on a passive skin sweep of the outer debris field. It was still transmitting, faintly, on a frequency the Dravari had apparently used for long-storage scientific records, the kind of signal designed to outlast whatever sent it, meant to be found rather than maintained. He brought it aboard and extracted the data carefully, because old Dravari encoding was fragile in the way of all things that had not been maintained. Most of what was on it was administrative. Inventory logs. Resource allocation records. The kind of documentation civilizations produced in enormous quantity because they believed they would be there to use it. At the end of the data, compressed into a final archival block that had been appended after the main filing, was a research manifest. Subject records from the Environmental Limit Program. Rows of entries. Each one a person who had been taken and placed somewhere impossible and checked on until there was nothing left to check on. Near the bottom of the manifest was the entry for Kareth 9. 2 subjects. One female, younger, noted as the first subject's daughter, born in the initial period of the experiment. The annotation on the first subject's file said, anomalous, persistent, recommend termination. Below it, in a different hand, with a later timestamp, recommendation not executed. Kareth 9 surface conditions assigned to complete the process. Below that, in the same second hand, with a timestamp that was 402 years old, no confirmation received. Kareth 9 file closed in error. Notation for follow-up. The follow-up had never come. The civilization had collapsed before anyone returned to close the loose and cleanly. The file had sat in the buoy for 4 centuries, waiting for someone to find it, in a dead system that nobody visited anymore. Ren copied the file to a personal data drive, small, plain, built for field use, and held it out to Ren. She took it with both hands. She looked at it for a moment, turning it slightly in her fingers, feeling the weight of it. Then she put it in the pocket of the jacket Soli had given her, which was too large for her, and which she wore with the sleeves pushed up. She did not say anything. She did not need to. They turned the ship for Kareth 9. On the journey back, Soli finished her report. She had been working on it since the caves, building it out, adding data, cross-referencing every scan result, every observation, every note from the days since. She wrote it with the precision she brought to all her medical work and with a care for language that she did not usually need to apply to standard reports, because standard reports were read by other doctors who already understood the framework. This report needed to be understood by everyone. She did not send it to the Commission. She did not send it to Director Vell or to Oritha's bureau or to the military intelligence contact, whose one question still sat in Doris's memory like a stone in a shoe. She put it on a general scientific frequency, public and unencrypted, the kind of broadcast that any ship with a standard receiver in range could read. She included every scan, every number, every impossible result. She included the photographic record from the caves. She included the medical conclusions in full. Her closing note read, "This child is not an anomaly. She is a proof of concept. Humanity does not require optimal conditions. Humanity requires only time." She hit send. She did not wait for Doris to approve it, because she was fairly sure Doris would approve it, and she did not want to waste the time. Doris, when told, said nothing for a moment. Then she said good. She said it with the same weight Soreth had used, as if the word meant more than its size suggested. Kareth 9 came up on the view screen, familiar now, brown and gray and yellow banded. The dead world that was not dead, the place that had decided to keep a human child and had done so long enough for the child to learn its language. They landed at the same cave mouth. The suits went on. The same protocol, the same careful check of seals and timers, the same weight of the planet pressing in through the material. The walk to the cave entrance was shorter than it had felt the first time, the way known roads always are. Ren walked without a suit. She always would. At the cave mouth she stopped. She turned and faced them. She looked at each of them in turn, Ren, Soli, Brev, Tarek, and finally Doris, with the same full attention she had given everything, the complete present focus of something that had never been able to afford distraction. Doris asked what she would do now. Ren looked at the ridge. at the yellow sky that pressed down over the equatorial rock, at the orange bioluminescent glow visible even from the cave entrance. Deep in the passage, the planet's own dim light showing the way. She said, "Learn the rest of it. Then I will come and find you." She said it the way she had stated everything. As fact, as something already decided. Not a promise built on feeling, but a plan stated plainly. The way you tell someone where you intend to be when the work is finished. She turned and walked in. The stalker came out of the dark of the ridge from a direction none of them had been watching. It moved low and smooth and enormous, its thermal sense organs tracking the heat of the group at the cave mouth with a calm, automatic precision. It passed them without stopping, without looking at them in any way that suggested they mattered to it. It went into the cave after Ren, unhurried, following her the way it would follow a known member of its territory, something with whom it had an arrangement. The dark took them both. Brev said, quietly, into the silence that followed, that she was going to be a problem for someone someday. He did not say it as a warning. He said it the way you describe whether you respect. Tarek said yes. He looked at the cave entrance for a moment longer. He said it like a man who had already picked a side. Doris filed her own report from the ship as they lifted off through the yellow clouds. She filed it on the same open frequency Soli had used. She put everything in it: the Dravari record from the buoy, the custody order from the commission, Soritha's archive findings, Drath's question and the answer, and why the answer was the concerning one. She included her own refusal of the custody order, cited by chapter and clause of field commander authority, leaving no procedural gap for the commission to use as a lever. She marked it for public record, and she sent it before anyone on the other end could file an injunction to stop it. The ardent measure rose above the clouds of Kareth 9 and leveled into orbital approach. Below them, the planet turned slowly, brown and gray and impossible, the same as it had always been. Except that somewhere in the cave networks of the equatorial ridge, a small light was burning. The same thermal vent, dammed and redirected with stones by careful hands, putting out its steady warm glow in the dark. The galaxy had written Kareth 9 off as a place where nothing could persist. It had been right, for everything it had ever sent there. It had simply failed to account for what happens when you leave a human child alone long enough for her to decide the planet is home. It had failed to account for what humans do with time. It would not make that mistake again.